Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final session of the Bretton Woods Committee's 2022 International Council Conference. We've had a fantastic week all week. Good to see so many of you in person and online. We've been talking all week about our conference theme, which is making multilateralism work. And I think we couldn't have a more apt conclusion to our International Council than our session today with this panel, which is going to be talking exactly about that topic. So I want to remind our audience that, as always, we'll reserve some time at the end for audience questions, and that if you do have a question, we ask that you please submit it in the question box in Zoom, and then we can call on you when it's time for Q&A. Let me quickly introduce my expert panel here. I'm so fortunate to be joined by this group. I think this is going to be a really fascinating conversation, and so appreciate you all being here to share your perspectives on this topic. I first want to introduce Axel Weber, who has recently retired from his role as chairman of UBS Group. He's had a long career in international finance, of course, including as chair of the IIF, former president of Bundesbank. He's at the ECB, long and storied career. So very much appreciate you being a part of BWC, Axel, and joining us today. We also have Joaquim Levy, who is Director for Economic Strategy and Market Relations at Banco Safra, and he's previously held positions. He was Brazil's finance minister, he was CFO at the World Bank, he was at the IDB, well positioned to speak on all of these issues. Very much appreciate you being here, Joaquim. And I should say, for those of you who haven't heard, the Bretton Woods Committee has formed a working group on multilateral reform, which we're discussing today, and we're so fortunate to have Axel and Joaquim, who are going to be leading that working group for us. So appreciate their leadership on this issue. We also have today with us Tran, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he spent a long career at the IIF. He has also spent time at the IMF, and he is currently working with the Atlantic Council on their project titled Bretton Woods 2.0. So he's going to share some good ideas with us today on what he's been cooking up over there. And finally, we have Nancy Lee, who is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. She's had a long and extensive career in development policy, including at the U.S. Department of Treasury, at the MCC, and also at the IDB. So Nancy, thank you very much for being with us. So I want to start with a question to all of you and get your kind of initial thoughts. You know, we're here in Washington, IMF World Bank meetings week. We've not been hearing a whole lot of good news about the global economic outlook this week. So I want to hear from each of you sort of, why is now the time to be discussing multilateral reform? We're hearing so much about it this week. Why is the time now? And what are your top priorities for multilateral reform? And Axel, why don't I start with you?
Well, so thank you. Thanks for having me. And it's a pleasure to be on this call. Let me start by sort of a persiflage of the multilateral institutions that a friend of mine used to make. He said the multilateral institutions were set up in the 1950s to solve the problems of the 1930s. And that is hardly going to be a relevant structure for the 2030s on which we're bordering. And we've had a number of developments over recent decades and over the recent, second half of the 20th century that have made these institutions very important. We had the global economy grow. We had countries integrated into the global economy that weren't part of it. The China story is a big one. And we've had several boosts of globalization. There was only one period where globalization over the last 100 years has slightly retreated, and that was the period between the First and the Second World War. Every other phase, there was a strong increase in globalization, to some degree then a wretched effect where we locked in that level of globalization, and then there was the next wave, whether it's the integration of the Japanese economy and the German economy back into the world economy pre-70s, whether it is the 1990s and 2000s where China's emergence caused a huge amount of global trade, payment flows, and diversification. We're now at a point where people are arguing that what will we see? First thing, we could see again a locking in of the current degree of globalization, but there could also be some retreat. I heard here over the last few days, people are talking about supply chains being disrupted and reorganizing supply chains. We see that in all of our corporate clients. There's people talking about nearshoring, onshoring, and friendshoring, which is a new term. And if you friendshore, you take a 20-year decision, you need to know not just who's your friends now, you need to also have a view on who's your friends in 10 to 20 years. So the whole geopolitical debate, the whole energy security debate comes on top of that. So we're facing a multiple layer of challenges at the moment for globalization, and the Bretton Woods institutions were the core of the public sector and the financial response to problems in the sense of the wheel of an increasingly globalized economy. And the risk we have with this atrocious war of Russia in Ukraine is that some of that is fracturing, at least around the perimeters of the global economy, whether it's sort of, trade disputes with China that we've seen, whether it is actually the national security and energy security discussions. They come on top of an important discussion in energy about energy transformation. And you're starting to see trade-offs emerge. When we talked about energy up to recently, it was all about how do we master the transition to a sustainable economy. Now it's how do we at the same time keep our economies going, and there is a trade-off between energy transformation and energy security. I very much fear that for a short time, actually, energy transformation might take the back seat relative to energy security discussions, which are much more powerful. And so I do think we stand at a crossroads for the global economy. I think also for the institutions that have been at the core of a multilateral response to problems in the global economy. And we need to have a good idea on how to evolve these organizations. And what I hear here in Washington at the moment from the heads of these organizations is that is an active and live debate. I don't think we have clarity yet on where this goes, because I think there is a multitude of things happening now where we first need to understand how will this develop in the long run. A resurgence of inflation. If you would have asked me 2 years ago, if we see massive inflation come back, will the IMF play a much bigger role in its traditional field of influence? My view would have been absolutely yes. You're likely to see currency crisis, you're likely to see balance of payments crisis. So the IMF is there. Why reinvent the wheel? We have an organization that deals with it, but it becomes a lot more complex. Inflation is hitting the poorest country at most. The war is impacting on food security. The World Bank, where Joaquim and I have worked together on some years ago on a capital increase for the World Bank in order to do its job. Well, it came at the right point in time because the World Bank has increasing challenges and needs for funding to do its job. So we are at a point where we really need to think forward for the next 10, 20 years on what is ahead. And the most important thing for me is we need to manage these years without countries losing access to capital markets, without countries losing access to financing, both by the public sector and leverage financing on top of that by the private sector. And how we work out the current debt stress that is about to develop is going to be a key indicator on how much capital and liquidity we can provide for emerging markets in the future. So let me end it here.
Thanks, Axel. I think you've kind of framed up nicely the complexity and the scale of the challenges that we're facing and the need for the institutions to evolve to address those. Joaquim, I want to turn to you and ask you to add your thoughts.
Okay. I think complementing what Axel said, there are three major factors that I think really bring this discussion very much alive. One is that we're facing, of course, very big challenges. It starts with climate, which is still there. It will still affect a lot of people, and we know that you have a short period of time to address how you finance the energy transition, how you finance not only the expansion of energy supply for a number of countries, but also the commissioning of fossil fuels, especially in part of electricity, while we wait for new modes of transportation. So there is this question that we're talking about trillions or many hundreds of billions, and these often affect developing countries. What kind of flows can we get there from public sector, from private sector? Well, so that's the first thing. The second thing, of course, is that for the largest shareholders of many of these institutions, the most traditional, is starting with the World Bank. Of course, there are very large budget constraints. They were already present with the current war, which is very much centered in Europe, and with the impact on the energy prices there, and the need to support households there. These budget constraints are even bigger. So it raises the question of how we're going to finance, to fund multilateral institutions, which would naturally be the most immediate tool to respond to the first challenge. And perhaps a third aspect is the new players that's there. Further, the whole thing about the capital structure of the multilaterals, given the different levels of development and the economic size of different players in the world. Of course, in the last 30 years, Asia has grown substantially. How this plays out in the ecosystem of a multilateral. Of course, you already have seen the creation of a few multilateral banks that have a significant participation of Asian countries. This is part of the major question: how you deal with the possibilities of finance of the institutions. And in this third part, there is also what is the role of the private sector and how it would these institutions, MDBs in particular, work with the private sector. We have to remember that, again, the World Bank lends to government. We have the IFC, but the World Bank per se lends to government. But at the same time, there's a huge expectation that most of the transition in electricity generation, etc., will be spurred by the private sector. And there are good reasons for that we can explore later. That has to do about the industrial organization of renewables, etc. So I think that these three things, the magnitude of the challenge, the specific situation of some traditional shareholders, and then the new players that we expect to be part of this major challenge, which is developing countries that have grown, as well as the role of private sector, really creates a number of questions of how we can get more from the institution, how we can support the MDBs, how we can integrate their action. And I think that there has been a lot of thinking, very productive thinking about that, but perhaps we have to go further. And I leave for talking later, there are a number of technical issues that have to be addressed. We should not forget that many of them are financial institutions, in the sense that you lend and you expect to get the money back, and even if it's a concessional level. And so you have to think carefully about what you require from them and how they're going to fund themselves, so that you have balance in both sides of their balance sheet.
Thanks, Joaquim, and I certainly want to get into some of these financing issues with you and Nancy in a few minutes. But let me turn to Home quickly to give his kind of overview thoughts.
Thank you very much, Emily. After Axel and Joaquim, there's not much that I can really add. I just want to point out that there's a big change in the nature of the problems facing us and the nature of the solutions that we need to provide. And that is, after the launching of the Bretton Woods Institution in the 50s, the nature of the focus and the problem is country-based. At the beginning, if a country follows wrong policies, it runs into balance of payment problem. The fund comes in and say, correct your policy, like overvalue exchange rate, then you can reduce your imbalances. It worked for a time, but then we run into another set of country-specific problem. Some country by design, by nature, by structure, for example, have very low savings rate. And if a country has low savings rate, they run into own kind of problem, deficit on the current account, deficit on the fiscal account, and so on. And the funds get into this structural reform requirement and so on, but that is country-based. But now we see more and more problems come from inter-country relationship and global challenges. Inter-country relationship means spill over. The action of one or two or a few countries really have spillover impact and hurt everybody else. And the example we have is clearly what's going on in the US. The authorities in the US let the inflation out of the bottle, came late to the tightening policy to control inflation, now have to catch up and tighten aggressively, more than expected. Everybody else suffer from this action, not just US consumers. In terms of common challenges, clear example is global warming, climate changes, and pandemics. They are common, they are global, and there's no national solution to those problems except global solution. However, unfortunately, the moment where we need global solution, the political foundation for that to be feasible has been eroded big time because of geopolitical tension, strategic competition and conflicts. And therefore, we have really a very dangerous divergence between what is needed and what is feasible. Going forward, I think that the debate about reforming the Bretton Woods institutions need to be proceeding. People need to think through what is required, what are the dimensions of the reform. But at the same time, I'm also coming to the view that while you debate the big picture, the ambitious and radical reform which are needed, you also should pay attention to the more mundane, narrower in scope, more technocrat in nature, which can be implemented within the current confines of resources at these institutions, which can be done. Because any demand, any reform that demand big contribution from countries to increase the resources for these institutions will be difficult to implement under the current political environment. So basically, we look at these things in our own project at the Atlantic Council. I propose 6 concrete technocratic in nature in terms of measures, and happy to share it with you later on.
Thanks, Home. Yeah, well, let's dive into that in a little bit later. But I think your point about the global challenges is a good segue to Nancy. And Nancy, maybe you can kind of provide us an overview of the conversation we're hearing about global challenges and how the World Bank and the MDBs can respond to those.
Thanks, Emily. And my colleagues have already done an excellent job of explaining the why. Reform is so urgent at this point. I would just add one point to that and then go into these questions of what direction reform should take. In addition to the pandemic, the inflationary, the macro stresses, and war, we're looking at a reversal in global capital flows now, which is very likely to drive more countries into financial distress. And it was very interesting during the depths of the pandemic, countries retained their access to capital markets, as Axel was pointing out before, and did not go at scale to the multilateral development banks or the fund itself, other than for emergency financing. And that may well change. So in addition to the SDG challenges, the climate challenges, food prices, et cetera, we may move into a period where there's sort of more conventional individual country financial crises. But with your indulgence, I can't resist sort of jumping into the what of reform. And let me just sort of put on the table 5 of my sort of top 5 wish list. The first is that everyone, that donors, the G7, the G20, all MDB shareholders, foundations, and even large private investors really conclude that the single most powerful and catalytic use of their additional dollars for financing global public goods is to put more capital into the multilateral development banks because of the powerful leverage and the enormous capacity that these institutions have developed over time. So not create more trust funds, small trust funds, not create more vertical funds, not more foreign financial intermediaries, and not put excessive emphasis on climate dollars in small climate finance funds, but rather to put it in the multilateral development banks. And the private sector can put capital into these banks in hybrid capital forms, which is one of the recommendations of the capital adequacy report that this independent panel of which I was a report mate, but we can come back to that. So, but to make wish number one possible, wish number two is that MDBs really have to demonstrate that that funding has real impact. And that means they have to move off of this notion of measuring impact simply by the volume of climate finance or the share of climate finance in their commitments. They have to start measuring outcomes, collective outcomes, and the contributions of individual countries to those outcomes. And it also means that they have to adjust the country-led model, and there has to be incentives for countries to make more investments into global public goods, as Secretary Yellen has pointed out, I think, in your forum and at the CGD. So wish number three is that MDBs diversify their tool mix away from their extremely heavy dependence on lending, and they actually help countries issue themselves sovereign issuances, and companies and financial institutions issue green and sustainable and social debt, and they can help those entities lower the very high transaction costs that we're seeing now, improve the terms, and also help countries verify that performance standards, SDG performance standards, have been met. Wish number four is that the institutions implement the recommendations of the capital adequacy review. And we can come back to that, but the bottom line is that the panel really found that if that were the case, if these recommendations were implemented across these institutions, it would drive hundreds of billions of dollars of increases in lending capacity over the whole system over the medium term. And that's not very surprising because since they're banks, relatively limited increases in capital have very large lending consequences. And then finally, wish number five, which is logical in my mind, but perhaps a little quixotic, which is that we really do need a global governance structure, a GPG governance structure that brings together the right countries, the MDBs, and the appropriate UN agencies, creates collective strategies and targets, and then holds those institutions accountable for those targets. I really think that's been a missing piece of the architecture for a while. I think now it is a glaring gap that has to be filled. And the last thing I would say is it has to be filled in a way that brings in the countries that are most vulnerable to some of these global threats, unlike the G20. So more of the countries that have that are vulnerable and that have the largest share of the global poor.
Thanks, Nancy. And I do want to dive into that a little bit before we kind of turn to the IMF agenda. I think this gap in the architecture in terms of the GPG governance structure is an interesting idea. And you hear sort of some different theories on how that should be done. Do we need a new institution? Can we reformulate some of what is already existing or create something new in what already exists? And then this capital piece, I think I want to get into the capital adequacy, but this is the conversation we're hearing so much about this week. And Joaquim said the scale of the problem is in the trillions. You've said that some of these recommendations in the report can unlock in the hundreds of billions. We've heard other people say maybe the tens of billions, but, sort of where does the conversation stand on capital in terms of doing more with what they have versus more capital for the institutions? So maybe Joaquim and Nancy, maybe to you both, kind of thoughts on that. Yeah, go ahead, Joaquim.
Look, I think that it's a crucial discussion, and there are some lessons actually from even generations ago about that. We have to recognize that some of the lending institutions, they have to fund themselves, and then they have to create a portfolio that those who are lending to them, those who are funding them, which is the market, recognize of a high level portfolio. So what we have, the big challenge is to strike a balance that, okay, you want to take more risks, but if you take more risks, then suppose you lose a AAA or whatever, and the price of your loan increase, what will be the effect on the borrowers? And you would that have a second round effect on the quality of your loans, and maybe where you end up in this process, and what kind of selection of the borrowers this could generate. And I highlight this because, of course, one or two generations ago, when IDA was invented, it was exactly because people understood that there was so much risk. The World Bank, as an institution that was basically funded by the market, could take and still attract the borrowers, so that you have this portfolio that is compatible to the kind of fund it seeks in the market. And this is why, in the case of IDA, for many years, actually, it was only capital, because people knew that they were lending to countries with much higher risk. Now, I think Nancy mentioned one thing that could be extremely helpful in addressing this question, which is the hybrid capital. Why? Because the hybrid capital would allow definitely the multilaterals to increase their risk, at the same time that they can keep lower funding costs, to the extent that you get people that might not be shareholders, you'll be ultimately subordinated lenders, so that you can strike a balance between the cost of funding and the being more ambitious in terms of leverage, etc., etc. So I think that this is an important discussion that need to be addressed. I think the capital adequacy report has some good suggestions, but we always have to be mindful of these aspects. Ultimately, if you want to have a balanced portfolio, you have to have a cost that also attracts sometimes middle-income countries that will have higher access to the market, so that you don't have a concentration of your portfolio to lower credits alone. And this is particularly important for institutions that don't do only projects, because projects are a sort of a different animal. And also, I think it will be important moving forward is to think, among the number of challenges that we discussed, what will be really the top priorities for the multilateral. As for any institution, clarity of objective is very important. And here, there's another set of choices that we need to make, which is, of course, I believe that the multilaterals have a fundamental role in helping shaping the energy transition. But if they become just a climate institution, we may again affect the creditworthiness of borrowers. So we have to keep some sort of balanced development goal, so that we lend them to address climate, but you also lend or we use whatever we support, let's not say lending, but to support them also to achieve their development goals, so that we know that the quality of the portfolio of the institution continues to be strengthened. So having these two kinds of balance is very important. Balance in terms of risks of the institution, and the balance of the use of resources of the institution. So you continue to have a balanced growth while you address forcefully the issues of the energy transition, and as well as adaptation and everything that goes with climate change.
Yeah, I think that last point is so important, Joaquim, because I mean, in this conversation that I've been hearing around this shift to GPGs, and especially in addressing climate, I think the emerging markets are saying, okay, yes, but not at the expense of our economic development, right? That the two have to be, it has to be a dual goal. Nancy, do you want to follow up here with comments?
Sure, and let me just pick up on the balance point that Joaquim made. This independent panel of 12 people, bankers, economists, but mostly people who really had been inside the institutions, and risk officers and financial officers. The question posed to this panel was, is it possible to make some financial changes that would maintain institutional ratings, and many of them have AAA ratings, but at the same time make more efficient use of capital and create some space to expand lending? So there were two things that were off the table for this panel. One was to advocate any change in institutional ratings, as Joaquim was mentioning, is very important for the cost of capital. And the second was we were not asked to comment on whether general capital increases were warranted for these institutions. So within that set of parameters, a very clear set of parameters, we did a lot of work, a lot of consultations with the institutions, with themselves, with credit rating agencies, with shareholders, with private investors. And the answer to the question turned out to be yes, that you could take some steps that would make more efficient use of capital without endangering ratings. And the reforms would fall into three buckets, and I'm not going to try to describe the entire report, but the first bucket is essentially, can you make more use of callable capital, this big share of capital subscriptions in capital adequacy frameworks? The second has to do with, can you offload some risk in a way that frees up capital for more lending? The third has to do with, can you offer new forms of capital, as Joaquim was mentioning, this hybrid capital concept that would be attractive to private investors that are interested in very sound, very safe investments that clearly have SDG credibility. And the third is, can you help all the key actors measure risk more accurately, so that credit rating agencies and private investors, shareholders themselves, and the MDBs really use the long track record of these institutions in both sovereign and non-sovereign lending and adjust their risk weighting. And so we found space in each of those areas for change that would create more lending space. And let me just say, in particular, one of the things that I really learned that I had not really understood when going into this is there is this database that combines all of the credits of the multilateral development banks, something like 15 institutions, and actually more, something like 20 institutions over time. It's essentially their credit performance in sovereign and non-sovereign lending, their probability of default, their expected credit losses. And that data has some very striking implications for risk weighting. We commissioned several studies comparing MDB credit performance to the credit performance of commercial institutions to the same borrowers. And we're unable to publish those studies at the moment. We have to get approval from the G20, but I can at least say that for publicly available data, when you compare that credit performance for sovereign lending, the performance of the MDBs is just much better than commercial institutions. So if you incorporated the implications of that for the risk weights, including of credit rating agencies, that could make a very significant difference in the amount of capital you have to hold against your lending portfolio. So these things that we're talking about here are actually not changes in the basic financial model of these institutions. They're not sort of quantum leaps in risk tolerance. I mean, people may believe that should happen, but that's not what the report is recommending. It's basically a way, coming back to the balance point, shareholders have a responsibility to prudently use capital, but they also have a responsibility to efficiently use capital. And this shifts the balance a little bit toward more efficiency without large costs in terms of prudence.
Yeah, I think, Nancy, as you outlined, it's sort of one first step in this conversation around financing. And I think Secretary Yellen and Assistant Secretary Latour too have said, this is the first step. We want to see an implementation plan by December. So this is a very live conversation. But I think, as Joaquim's outlined, it's one step, but there's going to be more steps needed after this, even with the implementation of the report's recommendations. I want to shift gears a little bit to the IMF side, because we've heard so much about the MDBs this week, and it's very live and current discussion. We've heard a little bit less about IMF institutional reforms, but I know Home is working on this topic, and I would love for him to share some of his ideas on sort of what the conversation is right now around institutional reform at the fund.
Thank you, Emily. But if I might, I just want to add one short comment on the previous discussion about the capital adequacy framework report. I read it with interest, and I think that one of the key is, yes?
Go ahead.
Yeah, one of the key issues there is really the pricing problem. If you want to leverage the balance sheet of the MDB to provide hybrid capital, to provide some risk sharing to catalyze private capital to come in, then there's a cost of doing this kind of credit enhancement facility. And right now, the problem is the cost to the MDB is high, and the price that the private sector investor want to pay so that the return is still attractive enough is low. So there's a gap there. But back to the IMF.
I think maybe before you go to the IMF, I think Axel might want to get in on the capital adequacy. So let's round that out.
Just also before we go to the IMF, I think, and Nancy said it, I think, to be honest, the G20 are completely kidding themselves if they believe that optimizing the current framework by squeezing through 5 levers some additional capital out of the existing MDBs, and it can all be done, Nancy, don't get me wrong. But if you look at the gigantic challenge we have of financing the transition, both on the climate front and on the development front, and these countries not forgoing their own future, and at the same time want to do this, and we saw that in the capital review that we did for the World Bank, excluding the very core question of additional capital for these institutions for additional tasks, in my view, is really falling short of the expectations that many of these low and lowest income countries should rightly have towards a developed world. This is not their global problem, because it's a global problem created by the industrial countries and their way of economizing and dealing with nature over the last 30 years. So it comes with an obligation that this externality that has been produced, and that is life-threatening for the planet, needs to be attached and needs to be faced with a lot of money from the developed world. And if we think about just optimizing around the perimeters of the given yes, of course, you can accept a bit more leverage capital here. You can accept a bit more sort of reduction in the, in the rating of these institutions. But what is needed here is not 1 times the capital, twice that. We talk about, multiple times of capital that is needed. And I absolutely agree. I mean, you didn't write the mission statement, so you were performing your task within the mission statement. But I think the G20 is absolutely kidding itself when it doesn't put the issue on the table of a lot more capital by the developed world in order to insulate the less developed countries from these global negative spillovers. And that's where I think we need to be very clear. The first order is, how can we raise additional money from the developed world to help the less developed world to pull through these global problems? I just wanted to put that on the table because it's all right what you said. I fully subscribe to it, but that's sort of the second derivative that we're optimizing rather than the first-time problem. Thank you.
If you wouldn't mind waiting one more minute on IMF, let's give Nancy a chance to respond.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. And no one should view enhanced capital efficiency as a substitute for more capital. In fact, we have to reverse that logic. We have to say more capital efficiency makes a better case for more capital because it's going to be more productive. So I'm speaking personally now, not as a member of the panel. I don't know what the panel's individual views about capital increases are. And then I just wanted to say on Hung Tran's point, it absolutely is the case that the price of risk transfers, which then free up capital, have to be beneficial to the institution's ability to lend productively for new activities, including climate finance. But I would emphasize that this point I was trying to make about data and the real value of preferred creditor treatment, and both, well, preferred creditor treatment for sovereign lending, but the benefits of having an MDB involved in private transaction is considerably larger, based on what we know so far in this analysis, than is understood both by the credit rating agencies and by private investors. So that cost of risk transfer can fall if A, that data were more available, and B, if the institutions went forward together to create these risk transfer products and at scale and across a lot of regions, so that these first mover costs with very high risk transfer costs could be reduced.
Thanks, Nancy. Home, I think we're ready for the IMF.
Right, thank you very much. The discussion about IMF reform is less newsworthy than the discussion about MDBs. But basically, we have two levels of discussion. One is more structural and has been going on for a long time. And that is how to improve and change voice and representation, basically the voting powers of the IMF and of the MDBs, to reflect the fact that the emerging market countries, including China, or particularly China, has increased their share of the global economic activity significantly over the past few decades. And yet their representation in these institutions are really outdated and nowhere reflecting their true contribution to the global economy. So voice and representation. Second is to increase the capital base of the IMF. Right now, through quota contribution, the IMF has about $650 billion capital base, and that amount was more than doubled by arrangement to borrow from creditor countries, giving the fund about $1 trillion in lending capacity. There's a fear that these borrowing facilities will expire in the next few years, and given the international discord that I mentioned earlier, there is a risk that they will not be renewed. And if these borrowing arrangement won't be renewed, the fund will be reduced to about $650 billion of capital. Therefore, their lending capacity will be severely reduced. So these two discussions are based on the fact that we currently have the 16th general review of quota, which is scheduled to be concluded by December 15, 2023. And there's hope that if nothing is improving or changing now, we will end up at the December of next year without any concrete results to show. So there's a risk that the 16th review will be coming up with no positive outcome on those both of these two important issues. The reason being, again, if you don't have consensus in the international community, particularly among the major countries, there's very little chance that there's agreement to support these two issues. Change of quota requires 85% vote of the IMF board, and very difficult to overcome if there is no underlying consensus. The second level of discussion is more concrete and falls more into my list of 6 concrete reforms that I have presented. Basically, it refers to how to make use of more distribution of SDR to countries. The previous distribution of SDR last year was very helpful for low-income country. But here, I need to correct a popular misunderstanding, is that allocating more SDR and distributing to countries is not a free gift. It's not a free lunch, because basically it is giving a credit line to countries. If they make use of that, they have to pay interest to the credited countries via the fund. So giving more SDR to countries only means that you give more debt, more loans to country, not grant and not free. Nevertheless, they become important and necessary during crisis time. The second idea, part of this practical approach, is to how the IMF can really improve the common framework for debt restructuring and debt treatment. Right now, the common framework is very little used. Only 3 countries, Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia, have applied. They have formed official creditor committees to discuss the parameters of the debt restructuring, but still yet to be concluded. The hope is by the end of this year or the next year, some progress will be made, particularly in the case of Zambia. The IMF, in my personal view, can do a lot to push for these things by, in the current discussion that I have with a dozen or more countries applying for IMF program, including middle income country, but in debt difficulties, they can push these countries to say, look, in order to get IMF loan, you have to push your creditors to set up 2 committees, like I said before, the official bilateral committees and the private bondholder committees, and make sure that they talk to each other so that they can coordinate and come up with the overall debt restructuring deal, which is comprehensive, which involves everyone and not just 1 or 2 groups of creditors. I think the IMF, because of the crucial role it plays now in negotiating these assistance programs, is in a strong position to push recipient countries to really demand their creditors to do these things. So I think those are some of the ideas that I have seen, and some other concrete ideas that have yet to be put on the table, but in my view, fairly easy to implement, is simply to reallocate lending resources among different group of countries. Everyone say that African countries, particularly sub-Saharan African countries, really suffer the most, not only because of pandemic, the impact on war, on food security and food supply, and inflation, high interest rate, capital outflow. Yes, they need a lot of support. But if you look at IMF lending, Latin America get 10 times more in terms of program size compared to African countries. Take 2 particular cases. Argentina in the last year got a $44 billion program, 1,000% of its quota. Zambia, a few months ago, got another program, $1.3 billion, only 100% of quota. So if you can kind of equilibrate and shift some of the resources that have been going to Latin American countries for a long time to African countries, you can give more to African countries to meet their need without changing the resource envelope. That is one of the concrete ideas.
Thanks, Home. I want to pick up on, I mean, I feel like this is the elephant in the room, but you mentioned it. I mean, quota review, and I'd like to get Axel's thoughts on this as well. I mean, those of us who were involved in the last round of quota review remember how long it took to finally get a portion of it approved and implemented. And that was in even a different geopolitical context than we are in now. So I mean, really, it seems like this is what has to be addressed and to really move the IMF forward. But I mean, what are the prospects? How are we going to tackle this time around?
Right. Well,
the last time we had this quota review and change was during the 14th review done in 2010, fully implemented in 2016. So one good thing is doubling of the quota. So that was the positive contribution. And second one is a minute or moderate change in the relative distribution of quota Basically, China is the major winner there. It goes from 3.8% of quota to 6.2%, China, at the expenses of Europe, UK, and other emerging market countries. And the share of the US was kept unchanged at 16.7%, giving it veto power in terms of major decision requiring 85% of the vote. That was done more than 10 years ago. Now, as you said, the international background is completely different. Instead of cooperation and trust, we have mistrust and enmity. I don't see any hope for any quota review or change in the next year or two.
Axel, what do you think?
Well, first, having been the German governor on the IMF in 2010, it's good to have been away for 10 years in a different job and to come back and to still have acute and up-to-date knowledge about the discussions, exactly where we stand. I would say two things. I remember very well the discussions in a basement in Korea at the meeting when we actually finally agreed on these quota changes. And, you know, I don't think, again, along what I said before, you can continue to optimize within that, but there are two major issues. The first one, and it's almost an untouchable, is the the US blocking majority on this makes any other reform amongst anybody else just a marginal shuffling around of quota from developed countries to China and to others. And I think that is too little and too short of expectation. So we need to think about a much more fundamental reform. And actually, given how the world has developed over the last 10 years, the seats around the table, in my view, are quite different. And the IMF has in its own shareholder base a lot of countries where we're starting to see, from the geopolitical tensions to some of the recent sort of trade disputes, that it increasingly is difficult to get to an agreement for something that requires qualified majorities among the rest, because the rest doesn't see eye to eye. So my guess would be, if we come back in 10 years' time to this discussion, we won't have progressed much more. And that means, you know, that can't be how we change the way going forward. And let me also remind you of a second thing, which Hung mentioned too. The increase in the quota happened because at the time, and the changes happened, and the additional money the IMF received happened because they draw on central banks and on central bank reserves and leverage that. That was easy to do when the world was in a financial crisis and where the core of the financial system was on the brink, and where central banks played a major role in stabilizing national financial systems and the international financial system. So it's obvious that central bank reserves were the first to go to pool of money that you could then leverage through the international organizations. That is not the case for all of the issues that Hung is pointing out that we want to address. Central banks have in themselves to play a role in the transition of, to a greener economy. And the ECB and Christine Lagarde talk about that a lot. But it's not clear whether central bank reserves are a key factor in moving there. And again, I would play the ball back more into the sphere of the World Bank and governments who need to commit true taxpayers' money rather than central bank reserves to solve some of these issues. And the very nature of the central bank reserves means, as Hung said, these are only credit lines that need to be paid back. And therefore, all you're doing is you're basically distributing money and giving credit and leading countries who, he mentioned 3 countries as an example, who already had a sustainability problem on the debt side, into more debt and into more credit. Let me give you one example. Among the lowest and low-income countries over the last 10 years, the servicing cost for credit they got relative to their revenues has increased from 6 to 10%. Whilst in the developed countries, it has moved from 6 to 4% of their revenues. So you're seeing a gap opening that the lowest income countries and low income countries face higher financing costs for their legacy debt that they have, but they also at the same time have massive needs for future investment to see their development and to see the energy transformation. And that is because I do think we have to stop thinking about this as loans and as credit lines, and really have to look at it as investment in infrastructure not in our home country, but in countries where that investment does make a bigger difference of investment of a similar amount of magnitude in our home country. So the whole idea of development needs to be rethought. When it comes to climate, we need to prevent climate changes from happening in countries that have very little alternatives to using coal, and we need to give them the alternatives to sustainable energy by transferring money for them to invest. So it's not about credit. It really is about long-term transfers of income into those countries to facilitate an energy transformation. And that has nothing to do with the IMF, in my view. It's nothing to do with central bank reserve. It really is taxpayers' money of taxpayers from the developed world to help taxpayers in the less developed world to do these investments. And I think that's what we should focus on in the financial sector. That is 40%, that is 20% of the money that goes to these markets can play a role in that. But the bigger role is with the Millennium Development Organizations. They're 40% of the financing, and with national development agencies. So I think you need to really bring everyone to the table to get this done. And the private sector, I can tell you from the IIF, we discussed that a lot, and we have a meeting this afternoon. The private sector is willing to reach a hand and to help these things, but it cannot be when there is a problem in debt that the first resort for restructuring is always the private sector, which I said is less than 20% of the money. If you insulate all public money from being part of a workout process by giving them super senior status, you will really create a lot of dynamic disincentives for the private sector to be part of these big-term projects.
We only have a few minutes left, and I think I want to end with a final question. We had some questions from the audience. Home has answered some of those in writing. So, I think what we're talking about a little bit, we've talked about institutional reform, but really what we're talking about is the political will, I think, to address the problem that we have in front of us globally. I think we saw with the great financial crisis, there seemed to be some political will to address that. We were in a different geopolitical climate. My final question to all of you is, are we going to be able to do it this time? Are we going to be able to come together as a global community to address the scale of the problem in front of us? Who wants to start? Nancy?
We have to unmute Nancy.
Yep.
I think there are some sort of preconditions that have to be met in order to drive that political will. And one of them I mentioned earlier, which is there really has to be, if in fact, a central challenge is to increase the fiscal capacity of these countries to make those investments, which create those global goods. The MDBs are front and center, but the MDBs really have to demonstrate that they're going to produce outcomes, adaptation outcomes, mitigation outcomes, resilience outcomes, and then also recovery outcomes, because we're talking about countries that are suffering huge costs from the climate change that's already happened. So I think the MDBs have to stop saying, here's what we're doing. We've 20% of our commitments were climate 2 years ago, and 30% are today. I just don't think that that's going to work. In addition, in order for governments to be incentivized to use their country finance envelopes in the MDBs for global public goods, there really have to be benefits for countries that are very clear in terms of their cost of capital, their tenors, their transaction costs. The MDBs have to make it attractive for those investments. And then the last thing I would say is the system is just too small. There just is not enough financing capacity. We did a calculation a few years back, well, during the pandemic, and we looked at the total volume of MDB finance for low income versus middle income countries in that period. And we took the IMF research that shows how much additional fiscal capacity is necessary to meet the SDGs. So this was actually even before the pandemic. And if you remember that research, it was something like 13, 14, 15% of GDP needs to be spent in addition in low-income countries to meet the SDGs. So if you assume, for example, that the MDBs are big enough, their commitments are big enough to add 3 percentage points of GDP to the fiscal capacity of poor countries, and maybe just 0.5% of GDP to the fiscal capacity of middle-income countries, MDB commitments have to be something like $230 billion a year, which is 60% bigger than they were in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. So we cannot escape this point that the system has to be bigger. In order to build the political will, you have to show the MDBs are actually achieving outcomes, but you also have to show that it's really efficient to put your dollar in an MDB as opposed to a bilateral or a trust fund at the MDB, to put it in the capital and get that leverage.
The leverage is the key. Joaquim, Axel, Home, any final thoughts to wrap us up? Are we going to be able to do it?
If I might, I think that in my view, there is no political will to cooperate to solve the problem, but even worse, in the sense that there is desire and willingness to decouple in tech sectors and other strategic products to ring-fence the economy for national security concerns. For example, in the COVID pandemic, we see that vaccine has been used not as an instrument for cooperation, but as a weapon to compete for national influences and so on. So I think that we should expect more stormy weather in the years ahead.
Okay, I think, yes, we can do it. Of course, usually people start to move when they feel the pressure, and unfortunately, we may need to feel more of extreme weather situations and the deterioration in some places to get a mobilization in the magnitude that both Axel and Nancy mentioned. And we have to see if this is possible just with budgetary resources for capitalizing multilateral banks, or you have to think other financial schemes on a global level, even if they may have some perhaps inflationary risks. But when the magnitude of the risk, the threat, is understood, I think there will be a really massive mobilization. Meanwhile, I'll take what Nancy Lee said. It's very important that people understand that, of course, putting the resources in one integrated structure, MDBs, and if they have some good governance and the right incentives, I think this is a productive way to concentrate capital and deploy it for the main challenge that you have today, both in terms of climate, of growth, of increasing debt with the global interest rates going up. I think they are vehicles that can still deliver a lot.
So might need to get worse before we can actually come together, but hopefully we can. And the MDBs are the most efficient way to do that. Axel, why don't you wrap us up here?
Well, I think Joaquim stole my line, so I fully support what he said. I don't think there is a lack of understanding of the depths of the problem, and in particular, the dynamics of it getting worse. And so I have a full confidence that things will get worse, and that in that, the usual notorical learning that we've seen on many of these institutions and policymakers will kick in, and there will be a call to action. So for me, it's unfortunate that we cannot have a rational solution before we actually see some of the fallout deteriorate and people start understanding that global public goods are in the interest of everyone on this globe. And it doesn't matter where these risks materialize, as long as they materialize somewhere on the globe, it should be seen as an early indicator for what can happen in our own country in the future. And I feel that at the moment, policymakers are failing global citizens to be proactive and to get the job done. It'll be with inflation. You first have to get things to get out of control to then get the determination to get the job done. I'm pretty sure that we can do better than that.
Yeah, thanks, Axel, echoing Joaquim there, I think. Well, we're over time, so I want to thank you all for staying a few minutes over. I found this to be really informative, and I hope Joaquim and Axel, you found this to be a useful input into our multilateral reform working group dialogue, and more to come on that. So that's a wrap on International Council this year. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a fantastic week, a little bit gloomy, but hopefully we can be a part of the solution going forward. So once again, thank you all for joining us today. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.